1635–1840. Imagine the slow movement of paper across a landscape of rolling hills. In 1635, King Charles I made the royal post available to the public. There were no zip codes, no sticky stamps, and certainly no speed. The story of the post is a story of ledger books. Think of a clerk in a dusty room in London, dipping a quill into an inkwell. He writes the name of a town, Bristol. He records the weight of a letter. He calculates the distance in miles. The postage wasn't paid by the sender, but by the person receiving it, based strictly on how many sheets of paper were used and how many miles the horse had to gallop. In 1784, the first mail coaches began to run. Imagine the sound of wooden wheels turning steadily on gravel paths, mile after mile, through the fog of the English countryside. The coaches moved at a consistent 8 miles per hour. They didn't stop for long. They just moved, steadily, through the night, under the moonlight, toward a small stone post office. The history of crop rotation in Norfolk before modern farming, fields had to rest. In the 18th century, the Norfolk 4-course system became very popular. It is a cycle that repeats every 4 years, forever. Year 1. Wheat is planted. The stalks grow slowly in the sun. Year 2. Turnips are planted. They sit quietly underground, growing larger in the cool soil. Year 3. Barley is sown. The wind blows through the grain, creating a soft, shushing sound. Year 4. Clover is grown for the livestock to graze upon. The soil is never rushed. It breathes. It recovers nutrients. The farmers watch the rain fall on the clover. Then, the cycle begins again. Wheat, turnips, barley, clover. For decades, this was the rhythm of the earth. The cataloging of the Great Doomsday Book, 1086. In the year 1086, William the Conqueror wanted to know exactly what was in his kingdom. He sent census takers to every village in England. Imagine a monk sitting at a long wooden table. He has a massive stack of parchment. He is recording the number of sheep in a tiny village called Shapwick. There are 34 sheep, he writes. There are 5 cows. There is 1 mill for grinding grain. He moves to the next village. He writes down the number of pigs. He writes down the acreage of the meadows. The ink dries slowly on the page. There are hundreds of pages. Thousands of cows. Tens of thousands of acres of quiet, still woodland. It is a giant book of lists, written in a silent room by the light of a single, flickering candle. The laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cable in the mid-1800s, men decided to lay a copper wire across the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. To do this, a ship had to sail very, very slowly across the water. Imagine the ship, the HMS Agamemnon. It is in the middle of the vast, blue ocean. On the deck is a massive spool of cable. The spool turns, slowly, letting the wire sink down into the dark, cold water. It takes weeks. The ocean is quiet. The ship moves at a walking pace. Down, down, down the cable goes, settling into the soft silt of the ocean floor, where it is dark and silent. There is no wind at the bottom of the sea. There is only the cable, resting in the mud, spanning thousands of miles of stillness. Tips for 2 hours of content. Since reading for 2 hours would keep you awake, here is how to use these stories to fill that time. Use a sleep story app or feature. If you are on a mobile device, highlight this text and select Speak. Set the speaking rate to 0.75x. Focus on the lists. As you listen or read, try to visualize the lists of sheep, the rows of turnips, or the miles of copper wire. The mind room technique. Imagine you are the clerk in the 1086 census. Visualize yourself slowly turning one heavy parchment page at a time. Would you like me to write more details about the history of brick making or the evolution of the...
Hello everyone. Today, you will learn interesting facts about the Middle Ages. Let your mind drift back to a world where time moved slowly. Where the world was quieter, except for the clanking of swords, the ringing of church bells, and the laughter echoing through stone corridors. Tonight, we will wander into the cobbled paths of the medieval world, where technology slumbered, and people thrived with the simplest of tools, oldest of customs, and strangest of habits. For the next 2 hours, you'll travel through forests thick with wolves, into dimly lit cottages, across bustling marketplaces, and into the grand stone halls of lords and monarchs, all without leaving your bed. Our story begins around the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Around the year 476 AD, what came after is often called the Dark Ages, though it wasn't quite as dark as many assume. For 500 years, there was no internet, no smartphones, no electricity, and yet life went on messy, vibrant, difficult, and deeply human. Let's start with something peculiar: hygiene. Contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages did bathe, but not as frequently as we do today. Public bathhouses were popular in many towns. Some even had scented oils and steam rooms. However, as the centuries rolled on, especially after letter by letter, there was no printing press until Johannes Gutenberg came along in the 15th century. Books were treasures. Let's walk into a medieval castle. The stone walls are thick and cold. Tapestries hang on the walls, not just for beauty, but for insulation. The Lord holds court in the great hall, where disputes are settled, alliances are made, and feasts are held. At night, the family and their guests sleep upstairs, some in beds, others on pallets or benches. There's little privacy, and people often shared sleeping space. Ever wondered what people did for fun? They played games. Dice, chess, and backgammon were popular. Minstrels played music, jesters told jokes, and tournaments provided thrilling entertainment. Knights fought in jousts to win fame and sometimes the favor of a lady. Now, here's something strange. People thought tomatoes were poisonous and that bathing could kill you. They believed in humorous bodily fluids that needed to stay in balance for good health. Common treatment: bloodletting. If you were sick, a barber surgeon might let your blood out with leeches or blades. But medieval people weren't all superstition. They built cathedrals that still stand today, without machines, using ingenious pulleys, scaffolds, and sheer will. They navigated by the stars. They told stories that survive to this day, like Beowulf and the tales of King Arthur. As you drift into sleep, think about the sound of a lute playing in the distance, the crackle of a fire in a stone hearth, the quiet prayers whispered in candlelit chapels. The Middle Ages were long and hard, but also rich with wonder, ingenuity, and resilience. This is just the beginning of your journey into the medieval world. Keep listening and let the centuries whisper you to sleep. Now, let's ride through the heart of the medieval countryside. There are no paved roads. Most are muddy tracks used by carts and travelers on foot or horseback. Imagine riding through the fog, hooves muffled on damp earth, birds calling in the trees above. Wayfarers stop at inns along the way's simple structures with wooden beams, where one might share a bed with a stranger and a meal of pottage, bread, and ale. Villagers huddled around manor houses or monasteries, and most people never traveled far from home. Life was local. The seasons ruled everything. Spring was for planting, summer for tending, autumn for harvest, and winter for surviving. If the crops failed, there was hunger. If disease struck, it spread quickly. But there was community, too. Feasts, fairs, saints, days hall, reasons to come together. People danced in circles, sang songs passed down for generations, and watched plays performed by traveling troops. These miracle plays taught biblical lessons, and they were often full of dramatic flair and even humor. Let us not forget the noble women of the Middle Ages. While often confined to the home or the convent, some women held remarkable power. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled vast lands and took part in the Crusades. Hildegard of Bingen composed music, wrote books, and advised popes. Noble women oversaw estates and peasants, while their husbands were off at war or on pilgrimage. Speaking of war, battles were brutal. Swords clanged against shields, arrows flew, and armor clattered as men charged across fields. Castles were besieged with catapults and trebuchets, massive machines hurling stones or fire. Yet, much of warfare was about waiting, negotiation, and intimidation. At night, when the work was done, people would gather by the fire. They'd tell tales of saints and sinners, of ghosts and fairies, of kings and the dragons they never really fought. Storytelling was an art, and stories were memory itself, okay? And now, as the stars rise high over the moors, and the last candle burns low in a window, know that medieval life, for all its hardship, was filled with humanity. Their laughter, their fears, their hopes, they echo still across the stone walls of abbeys and the buried foundations of long-lost villages. So close your eyes and listen as the Middle Ages cradle you gently in a tale spun from time and truth. A terra, there is herbs and scriptures. They were the guardians of knowledge, and many of their libraries became the foundation for the Renaissance to come. Imagine a monk hunched over a desk, quill in hand, copying a manuscript under the flicker of an oil lamp. His hands are steady, trained. His margins are decorated with ivy leaves, tiny dragons, and saints in flowing robes. This was his life, quiet, repetitive, but full of purpose. Elsewhere, traders from Venice to Constantinople exchanged spices, silks, and stories. Caravans trudged along dusty roads, carrying goods and gossip from east to west. Through these trade routes came not only wealth, but ideas about medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The Islamic world, in particular, preserved ancient texts that Europe had forgotten, only to return them centuries later. Now, let us peek into a medieval kitchen. The fire is always burning. Iron pots hang over the hearth. A woman stirs a stew of onions, herbs, and barley. Spices, like cinnamon or cloves, are prized to use sparingly, often locked in tiny boxes. Bread is a staple, but not the soft, fluffy kind you might know. It's thick, hard, and sometimes even used as a plate to trencher, soaked with meat juices by the end of the meal. Children giggle in the corner, chasing a wooden hoop. The cat watches, lazily swishing its tail. Outside, a bell tolls the signal to gather for evening prayer. Sleep, dear listener, knowing the Middle Ages were not a time of darkness, but of starlight. Quiet, distant, sometimes dim but always glowing. A world made of effort and endurance, song and silence, dust and dreams. The fire dims, the wind whispers through the trees, and the past folds gently over you like a blanket. As we continue our gentle journey through the winding corridors of the Middle Ages, let's open the door to the village blacksmith's forge. It is early morning. The air is cold, but the forge is hot, fiery red and hissing with steam. The blacksmith, strong and soot-streaked, hammers out tools, horseshoes, nails, and sometimes weapons. His work is essential. Every village needs him. Sparks dance in the air as metal meets metal, rhythmically, like a lullaby for the Iron Age. Nearby, the mill turns slowly with the flow of the river. Water wheels creak, grain is ground into flour. Only reading, but dancing, court etiquette, sewing, and singing. Young squires, trained to become knights, learning to ride, hunt, and fight with chivalry. The path to knighthood was long and arduous, requiring service, strength, and honor. And what of the weather? Winters were bitter, with snow piling on thatched roofs and wind whistling through wooden shutters. Fireplaces smoked, cloaks were pulled tight, and food was carefully rationed. In the summer, fields glowed golden with wheat. Children ran barefoot through wildflowers. Life was hard, but it had its simple joys. Now, let us float quietly into a medieval apothecary. Shelves on faith. Astrology was studied alongside astronomy. Comets were omens, and eclipses were feared. People looked up with both awe and dread, believing the stars held secrets meant only for the wise. Let's walk through the town again, just before bedtime. The market is closing. Candles flicker in windows. A mother rocks a baby to sleep with a lullaby that's been sung for generations. The streets are quiet now save for the bark of a distant dog and the soft tolling of the chapel bell. The air is heavy with incense and wood smoke. Somewhere, a traveling bard strums a lute, his voice weaving through the alleys. He sings of love lost, of noble quests, of magic and fate. His song is carried on the wind, wrapping around you like a blanket of sound and story. The world slows. You are safe. You are warm. You are drifting gently through a 1,000-year-old dream where the past breathes quietly just beyond the edge of sleep. Good night.
No matter how thick the walls, the night always found its way in. Sleep was never about conquering the cold entirely. It was about learning to live with it, draft after draft, until morning broke. You picture yourself approaching the hearth of a castle bedchamber, expecting salvation in the blaze. Surely a fire in a stone room must mean warmth, but the reality is far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces were enormous, their chimneys yawning wide enough that entire trees could be fed into them. Yet for all their spectacle, they were poor at actually heating the space. The reason was simple physics. The wider the chimney, the more heat escaped directly upward with the smoke. Flames roared, sparks danced, logs collapsed into glowing embers, and yet stepped more than a few paces away, and your breath still misted in the air. The fire created a bright oasis of heat in its immediate circle, but beyond that, the castle chamber remained bitterly cold. Household records emphasize how much wood this demanded. A single winter week in a large castle might consume entire wagon-loads of timber. Forest management became a constant concern, not just for construction but for fuel. One lord in France complained bitterly in his letters that keeping his great hall warm had emptied the woods faster than any war. Fires devoured resources, yet rarely provided the comfort one imagined. There are amusing accounts too. Guests sometimes joked that noble fireplaces were big enough to roast an ox but too weak to warm a man. The exaggeration rings true. These hearths provided spectacle. No matter how thick the walls, the night always found its way in. Sleep was never about conquering the cold entirely. It was about learning to live with it, draft after draft, until morning broke. You picture yourself approaching the hearth of a castle bedchamber, expecting salvation in the blaze. Surely a fire in a stone room must mean warmth, but the reality is far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces were enormous, their chimneys yawning wide enough that entire trees could be fed into them. Yet for all their spectacle, they were poor at actually heating the space. The reason was simple physics. The wider the chimney, the more heat escaped directly upward with the smoke. Flames roared, sparks danced, logs collapsed into glowing embers, and yet stepped more than a few paces away, and your breath still misted in the air. The fire created a bright oasis of heat in its immediate circle, but beyond that, the castle chamber remained bitterly cold. Household records emphasize how much wood this demanded. A single winter week in a large castle might consume entire wagon-loads of timber. Forest management became a constant concern, not just for construction but for fuel. One lord in France complained bitterly in his letters that keeping his great hall warm had emptied the woods faster than any war. Fires devoured resources, yet rarely provided the comfort one imagined. There are amusing accounts too. Guests sometimes joked that noble fireplaces were big enough to roast an ox but too weak to warm a man. The exaggeration rings true. These hearths provided spectacle, light, and a sense of majesty, but little real relief against the unrelenting chill of stone walls. Some households experimented with placing iron firebacks behind the flames, reflecting heat into the room. Others lined hearths with tiles to store warmth a little longer, but these measures were partial solutions, tinkering against a problem too large to conquer fully. A blazing fire might keep your feet warm if you sat right in front of it, but your back remained icy, and your bed across the room might as well have been outdoors. Scholars still dispute how effective castle fireplaces truly were. Some argue they provided meaningful warmth when combined with hangings and heavy furniture, creating a layered system of heat retention. Others contend they were almost symbolic, more about status and ritual than comfort, since most of the energy vanished up the chimney. The truth likely varied from castle to castle, depending on resources, design, and climate. Now imagine yourself in such a room. The fire crackles loudly, spitting sparks onto the hearthstones. Smoke curls upward, leaving a faint tang in the air. Your face feels flushed, prickling with warmth, but your shoulders remain cold. You shuffle closer, holding out your hands, until you nearly singe your sleeves. Then, reluctantly, you retreat to your bed across the chamber, only to find the temperature drops with every step. By the time you slip under the blankets, you may as well have been sitting outside. Peasants, by contrast, often benefited more from their smaller hearths. A single central fire in a modest cottage heated the whole interior, smoky though it was. The cramped space meant that flames and bodies together maintained tolerable warmth. The grand noble fireplaces, by contrast, burned through resources but left chambers half frozen. Grandeur once again failed to translate into comfort. And yet the ritual of the fire mattered. It wasn't just a...
It was a long, biting test of endurance, where life clung to the warmth of glowing coals and togetherness meant the difference between waking up and never waking at all. It was a delicate and desperate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you scorched your cloak or blistered your face. One wrong move and you'd end up looking like a half-cooked roast. The fire didn't care about fairness. Its warmth didn't reach out kindly. It poured forward a moment too far and the cold crept in like a thief. Too close, and you risked waking up smoldering. Sleep, when it came, was awkward and half-frozen. If you fell asleep facing the fire, you might be lucky enough to have one side of your body warmed while the other side froze stiff. People woke with joints that felt carved from stone, backs that ached from cold, faces that steamed from heat on one side and tingled with frost on the other. That was considered a good night, and you weren't alone. If the fire was still talking, then so was your heart. Outside the fire's flickering circle, the world was cruel. Cold air slithered through every crack in the wooden walls, through the straw-stuffed floors, under the door, around the shutters. The wind moaned like a beast, scratching and clawing at every surface, testing for weakness. And sometimes it found one. No one, absolutely no one, survived winter alone. That wasn't resilience. That was suicide. If you didn't have a family, you joined one. If your fire died, you found someone whose didn't. If you were too proud to knock, someone knocked for you. Medieval survival was a community effort, loud, messy, and utterly necessary. Villages weren't just groups of homes, they were lifeboats. Whole families, and sometimes multiple families, crammed together into a single smoky hut, piled under cloaks and hay, bodies pressed together like bricks in a chimney, all just trying to make it through the night. If the smoke from someone's chimney stopped rising in the morning, someone noticed. If no footsteps pressed into the new snow outside a home, someone checked. Maybe because they cared. Maybe because they owed them a favor. Maybe because they didn't want to find a frozen corpse come spring. Watchers kept quiet tabs. They weren't appointed. They were the old, the young, the ones who couldn't work the fields but still had their eyes and ears. They noticed who was coughing too hard, who skipped market day, who were lucky, a watery stew if you had hope. Sometimes there were communal meals, bitter broth shared among too many bowls. But people shared. Not because they were saints, but because starvation didn't discriminate. Even children pulled their weight. They carried embers in clay pots. ran across ice to fetch a neighbor, hauled bundles of sticks twice their size. They knew what was at stake. No one had to explain it. You lived it. You breathed it. You felt it in every shiver. And yet, somehow, life continued. People still argued. Old feuds simmered beneath the surface. Whose goat ate whose grain? Who never returned a borrowed pot? But cold had a way of cooling tempers. Because no matter how much you hated someone, if they knocked on your door with blue lips and frostbitten fingers, you let them in. The village became one breathing creature. Snoring, coughing, shifting, surviving. No privacy. The soul of the household. People prayed to it, sometimes directly. They whispered thanks as they added a log. They murmured hope as they stirred the coals. Faith wasn't a Sunday affair. It was in every breath you took before sleep, in every ember you shielded from the draft, in every prayer said without words. Because in the dark, you didn't just fear the cold. You feared being forgotten. You feared the quiet that came when no one was listening. But the fire, it always listened. It cracked back. It replied with warmth. It stayed when everything else wanted to leave. That was winter. Not a season. A gauntlet. A trial by ice. And through it all, people endured. Together. Shoulder to shoulder. Soul to soul. With hay in their hair, smoke in their lungs, and warmth in their hearts. One ember at a time.
That guided its people. We will meet a legendary figure whose life moved between courage and expectation, explore the mysteries of ritual and folklore, and then glimpse the contrasting world of the village elite. There is no need to hurry. You are here simply to observe, to drift alongside the villagers, and perhaps to let your mind rest, carried by the gentle sway of history. Take a soft breath, and as you exhale, imagine stepping through a low gate into this village, where time seems to move more slowly, measured by the seasons and the rice paddies begins. The earth is soft and muddy, squelching around your ankles as you bend low, planting each rice seedling with care. The sun slowly climbs, warming your back, while the occasional mist still lingers in the distance. Alongside planting, you might tend to thatched roofs, repairing broken sections with bundles of straw. Your hands smell faintly of straw and earth, and the repetitive motion sets a slow rhythm to your day. Sometimes, a samurai passes through, checking the village, reminding you of the taxes and duties owed. You would bow, quietly, and continue your work, feeling the weight of obligation press gently, like the clouds overhead before a drizzle. Lunch might be simple, a piece of rice, perhaps a few pickled vegetables. The food is modest, but it sustains. You eat slowly, appreciating the calm quiet that surrounds the fields, the faint calls of birds, the ripple of water over mud. Then, back to work, weeding, tending livestock, gathering firewood. Each task blends into the next, the day marked by small, careful movements and the soft, steady rhythm of survival. As the sun begins to dip, painting the sky with muted pinks and oranges. The work is far from over.